Caesar's Messiah, Shredded, Part 2, the Flavians and Josephus. We did a Part 1 last time, and we went through the first 6 or so minutes of the video, the documentary, Caesar's Messiah, Shredded. I guess I wouldn't call it a documentary because it does not document anything except Joseph Atwill's musings, his speculation, and his conjecture. But we're going to continue on through the video and go line by line, go frame by frame, and we're going to talk about everything that's in it. You will notice that it takes about 3 times as long to go through the video and unravel and debunk everything that he says than it does to just watch their video, because I'm actually impressed. He is able to weave so many lies into such a small space of this video. But let us continue on our path, on our journey here, to see what else is in this video of Joseph Atwill's.
The Flavians are not a household name, and yet it's the Flavians who completely reshaped the Roman Empire. In Rome, of course, there's the Colosseum, which is understood to be the best known monument of the ancient Roman Empire, perhaps. The Colosseum is in fact a Flavian construction produced during the Flavian period. It's under the Flavians that both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity take shape.
It's under the Flavians that Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity take shape. This statement has no basis. He doesn't give any evidence either for it, but he's, in a general, very general sense, in the first century, he's correct, but these things did not happen together. Christianity took shape in about 30 AD when Jesus Christ was crucified by the Romans, and Christians were writing the writings of the New Testament and other Christian writings all through the 40 years between 30 AD and 70 AD, when the destruction of the temple occurred in Jerusalem. And so the statement he makes is just misleading, to say the least. The Christian writings we have were well before the Flavian emperors began to reign. He says that Rabbinic Judaism was developed, but it was because the temple was burnt to the ground in 70 AD by the Romans, and they could no longer practice their temple rituals, which was the basis of their religion. So they had to turn to Rabbinic Judaism, which was a heavier leaning and reliance upon the teachings of the rabbis, which is why it's called Rabbinic Judaism, because they had no temple anymore. They didn't have a place to house and headquarter their religion. And so they had to do that, and this is why Rabbinic Judaism came about in around 70 AD, because the temple was destroyed. Now just be aware as we go forward here, this section has a lot of just kind of background history, so there's going to be some longer segments in this section, so just to be aware.
Why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions?
Why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions? Well, I don't know. Why would they? You haven't really told us. We have no evidence of this from scholarship, so apparently we're relying on your video to give us information on why the Flavians would create a religion, because there's no evidence of this anywhere in any writings of the first few centuries, during the Flavian period or afterwards.
Much like today, their era was marked by political power struggles, a bankrupt economy, religious conflicts, and endless wars. In the midst of this turmoil, the Flavians seized control of the Roman Empire and ushered in an immense paradigm shift.
So back to the question they stated before, why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions? They didn't tell us. And they continue to do this throughout the video. They're going to ask a question that raises a doubt in your mind, but then if you pay attention, which they're hoping you won't, they don't answer the question. They just raise the doubt and leave it hanging. They told us a lot about the Flavians, but they did not substantiate their underhanded point about them creating religions. Perhaps that will be further in the video. Let's find out.
To understand the Flavians' rise to power, we need to go back to the reign of the previous powerful rulers, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Beginning with Julius Caesar in the year 49 BCE, the Julio-Claudians ruled Rome for over 100 years, transforming the government from a republic into an empire. This family contained all the famous Caesars: Julius, who predated the time of Jesus; Augustus, who was Caesar at the time of Jesus' supposed birth; Tiberius, who ruled during Jesus' supposed death, followed by the infamous Caligula; then Claudius, and ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero, whose reign begins in 54 CE.
All right, so here they have given us a little bit of a history lesson. And there's nothing terribly wrong with what they've said at this point, with what they've said in this segment. They simply stated the Julian line of Caesars through the 1st century up to Nero's suicide in 69 AD, which, if you don't know much about the history of the Julian line and everything that happened up until that time, the Roman Empire was in turmoil. Nero committed suicide. It almost tore the kingdom apart. It was a very raucous and terrible time for the Roman Empire, and that didn't immediately change when the Flavians came into power. They had to work to build it back, and part of that was helped by the fact that they took many Jews prisoners and made them build things like the Colosseum and other structures in the city of Rome. By the way, have you heard of the Neronian persecution? Because it is a known fact in history that Nero killed many Christians by burning them and having wild beasts tear them apart and throwing them into vats of boiling oil. So this flies in the face of this whole video of Caesar's Messiah by Atwill, because he wants to contend that the Christians weren't in existence until after 70 AD, that it was completely made up. But we have this information from other writings in history. So it doesn't make sense what you're saying, Joseph. Does this also maybe show you a pattern of how the Roman emperors tended to deal with Christians? They were persecuted. They were killed. Nero actually went after the Christians. Some of the Caesars didn't do that, but we do have record of that with Diocletian in 200 AD. So it was a common occurrence that the Romans didn't have much respect for the Christians, and they didn't see them as much of a threat or care much about them, except when they had, like Nero wanted to just kill them. So it kind of shows you the pattern of how Romans truly treated Christians, and that they didn't have any need or thought to subvert Christianity or use it or create it. It already existed.
The Julio-Claudians enjoyed a godlike status until the family degenerated and began to damage the Roman Empire.
By the time of Nero, his famous decadence was bankrupting the empire, and the Jews of Judea were staging a huge rebellion against their Roman rulers.
Judea was one of the many conquered provinces that made up the Roman Empire. This region, which was also known as Palestine, was controlled by a family that served as Rome's tax collector, the Herods.
They were a Greco-Arab family, somewhat possibly Judaized, though only Judaized when it was convenient to please the subjects they were given, who were put in power in Palestine and destroyed the previous Jewish ruling family, the Maccabean family, root and stalk.
Besides being heavily taxed and ruled by a non-Jewish family put in power by Rome, the Jews were further inflamed by the requirement that a statue of the Caesar be placed for worship in every temple throughout the empire.
There's nothing terribly wrong here. We're just getting a history lesson, so we will just continue.
In the Roman Empire, you could pretty much have any god you want But legally, you had to submit to the emperor as a god as well. You had to at least acknowledge that the Roman leader was also a divine figure. But the Jews would not have any of it.
It's fundamental to Jewish belief that you shall make no graven images. It's one of the commandments given at Sinai by God. So the Jews never made representations of God.
The Jews had a very different type of religion. They had a religion which was much more focused on the book and less focused upon cultic statues. This presented a real problem for the Romans. They tried to install statues of Caesar, but the Jews weren't going to buy that at all. In fact, it aggravated them, it enraged them, and the Romans really, I think, didn't understand this. It's not statues, it's books.
So this is just really a history lesson on the rise of the Jewish zealots and the first Jewish revolt, which is what we're going to be talking about through most of this video, in about 66 AD to 70 AD, and just shortly thereafter to about 73 at the fall of Masada. But just realize that they conflate all the Jews together at this time period and try to make you think all the Jews wanted to fight Rome, and that all the Jews were militaristic and wanted to destroy Rome and bring in a Messiah. But that's not true. Only the zealots were militaristic. That's a faction of the Jews. The greater majority of the Jews wanted to live at peace with Rome so they could continue practicing their religion. And it's just not true to say that they all wanted to fight Rome and establish their Messiah in some way. So it's disingenuous. They will continue to do that, though, throughout.
And those books contained what are known as the Jewish Messianic Prophecies.
The thing that most moved the Jews' revolt against Rome was an obscure prophecy from among their writings that a world ruler would come out of Palestine.
An obscure prophecy that a world leader would come out of Palestine. Using the word obscure here is just really incorrect. The prophecies of the Messiah were all throughout the prophets of the Old Testament. He would have authority over all, this Messiah. He would save Israel from their enemies. He would rule all nations. He would also be a prophet. That's not militaristic. He would heal. That's not militaristic. He would also be killed for it. That's not militaristic. So did the Jews really want this Messiah, or did they want a warrior? Now, there is a lot of... it's very obvious that the Jews were confused. It's very obvious when you study the scriptures that, and even if you talk to modern Jews, they have this conception of Messiah that's different than what some of their own scriptures say. And that at this time they were blinded by both their Babylonian heritage. Remember, they had been captive in Babylon for a long time, which skewed their perception of their coming Messiah. And they also had taken up pagan idol worship. So they weren't even worshiping correctly the God that they were supposed to be serving and that was going to send their Messiah. So did they really have the correct perception of what their Messiah would be anyway? It's possible that they expected a warrior, and this was incorrect. The word Messiah does not mean warrior, and they're going to try to make you think this in Atwill's book and video here. The word Messiah means anointed one, and that is a king. Some of their kings were warriors, but some were not. So it does not mean warrior, but Atwill's going to keep making that point.
Holy books inspired the Jews to expect a redeemer who would redeem Israel, rescue Israel, restore Israel to power and leadership in the world.
The Messiah that the literature described was a warrior. The Messiahs would have claimed the same attributes that David did. David could overcome any army because God gave him the power to do it.
Messiah was to be a warrior. I told you they're going to keep trying to hammer this point home, and because it helps their narrative as they move forward. And yes, I do think some Jews thought their Messiah was supposed to be a warrior. Again, it was probably mostly the militaristic Jewish zealots of the first century that were causing the Romans all the problems. while the vast majority of the Jews were just practicing their religion and trying to stay out of the way of the Romans because the Romans were ruthless. I think that this Messiah as a warrior may have been an interpretation of the prophecies that some of the Jews had, especially to the materialistic Sadducee Jews. These Jews denied the spiritual, so of course they saw their coming Messiah as a earthly warrior that would help them conquer the Romans. Also, the Babylonian doctrines they had absorbed during their exile clouded their perceptions of the messianic prophecies. But when Christ comes in 30 and starts his ministry in 30 AD and tells them that the kingdom is spiritual, many of them don't believe him. They don't receive him as Messiah because they don't expect a spiritual kingdom. They're not thinking that way, and it's wrong. He explains to them that he will reign with authority from heaven, but this doesn't fit their model of Messiah, so many Jews don't follow Christ. That's exactly what's in the scriptures and all of the early Christian writings and the writings of the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, but it's ignored in this narrative. Messiah means anointed one, as I had said. This was done to kings and not necessarily warriors, although some of their kings, like David, were known for being warriors, as well as kings and good rulers. David wasn't always out on the battlefield, but he did lead in that regard, in a sense. Some of their kings had absolutely nothing to do with the battlefield. But they, in this video, Caesar's Messiah wants you to think that that word means warrior. And they're going to want you to think that everything that led up to AD 70, the destruction of the temple, and the whole Jewish movement in the 1st century was all due to a militaristic Judaism. And there were zealots who were, but it was not the entire Jewish race.
If you had the power of God, you could easily defeat the Roman army. The people rebelled against Rome and were led by a messianic movement that had a series of messiahs that had come forward to fight against the Roman Empire.
A Jewish messianic movement. The deepest cause of the war was the impoverishment of the Jewish peasantry. This is out of Josephus. 60 years of Roman taxation had meant, this is not out of Josephus, but I did find him historical writing that had this information. The Jews were mostly upset because the Romans were taxing them to death. And the Romans had invaded Jerusalem already and were taking some control of their mercantile system. And they were taxing all the Jews. And so 60 years of Roman taxation had meant one thing, that the Jews had to pay money, which was spent in Rome and Italy and on the border, instead of in their towns in Palestine. Judea had become substantially poorer, and many peasants had been forced to mortgage and sell their land. Besides, in Jerusalem, many people had also become unemployed when the renovation of the temple was finished in 63. They didn't have anything to do anymore because the Romans were taking control and pushing their way into their system of government. And just remember that in this time period, Josephus even records that there were signs in the heavens. There were all these different signs in the heavens at this time. There were comets, stars, and visions, multiples of each. There were eclipses, multiple eclipses throughout the years leading up to 70 AD. There were also earthquakes in all the land, and this is exactly what Christ had foretold in the Gospels. There were at least 15 earthquakes during this period. Some Jews saw these signs, and Josephus writes this. He says the Jews saw these signs as portents of their Messiah's coming. They didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah because they were expecting something a little different, and they refused to acknowledge him as the Messiah. Some of them, especially the zealots, were looking for more of a leader, an earthly leader who was going to change their situation with Rome. And that's true, but All these things are wrapped up in the scriptures, as well as the writings of Josephus and other 1st century and 2nd century historians. There are more than just Josephus. That's another lie they're going to tell you in this video, is that only Josephus's history was kept. But there are others: Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio. It's just so many lies woven into this video.
The Hebrew word Messiah is translated into Greek as Christos, or Christ, so the title of Christ can describe any of the numerous messiahs of this movement.
Any of the numerous messiahs of this movement. Well, that would make sense if any of the Christian writings called Jesus just the word Christ, but they don't. They call him Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah, over and over again. That's why it's Jesus Christ. It's not just Christ. It never says that. None of those writings. But you would think if they're going to assert that the Flavian Roman emperors wrote these writings, that it would have used the term Christ. It didn't. He was the prophesied Messiah. Jesus Christ was the prophesied Messiah. Period.
Yes, the word Christ or Christians can refer to the Palestine Messianic movement, but it's a later term. It's a later reformulation of the Messianic movement.
Also, numerous messiahs of this movement, I had to ask the question, what messiahs? Josephus says this, and this is probably where they got their information, but they've twisted it. Josephus only says, another body of wicked men also sprung up. They were deceivers and deluders of the people, under the pretense of divine illumination, prevailed on the multitude to act like madmen, and went before them in the wilderness, pretending that God would show them signs of liberty from Rome. It doesn't say they claim to be messiahs. And then in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews 20.8.6, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet. He said further, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down. So another one comes out and says he's a prophet. He didn't claim to be the Messiah. So it's funny that they go to this length to tell you there were numerous messiahs during this time period. These were not claimed messiahs. Josephus doesn't say as much. And Josephus knew very well their prophecies of a Messiah. He mentions it in other places, but not in regards to these people. So what Joseph Atwill are you talking about? What messiahs? Give us some real evidence. Give us some references.
This movement rebels against Rome in 66 and is successful. It actually defeats them militarily. So it must have been a huge movement.
And by the way, again about these numerous messiahs, there's others that are mentioned, but they're not messiahs. In Antiquities 20.5.1, a certain magician whose name was Theudas told them he was a prophet, not a messiah, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words, but of course he failed to do so and then was killed. And then in Josephus' Antiquities 20.8.6, impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them in the wilderness. Again, not messiahs. They just were deluding people and trying to extort money from them and stuff like that. There were no messiahs. Nobody claimed to be a messiah that we have recorded.
The victorious Jews set up a nation state directly in the Roman Empire.
And the Romans had to do something about it. There was a real danger that this Messianic movement could not only boil over in Judea itself, but could spread to other Jewish communities and other parts of the Roman Empire.
He says there was a huge movement. But yes, it was a large group of Jews, but it was not a Messianic movement, as they keep on saying. It was a movement of Jewish zealots who were angry and they wanted to take up arms, while the majority of the Jewish populace did not. He hasn't established that it was Messianic with a single shred of evidence. He's given no information or references that it was Messianic in nature. And they'll just say these things and move on, like you're supposed to just swallow it, hook, line, and sinker. They're hoping you don't know the truth. They're just going to keep going. Again, it's unsubstantiated, unsupported, that this was just a messianic movement. And we just read some other history information that told you it was about the fact they were taxed to death by the Romans, and that the Romans were encroaching upon their system of law and governance for the city of Jerusalem.
Rome ruled its colonies with a rod of iron, and any resistance was going to be met with brute force.
It's just a history lesson. We'll just keep moving on.
At this time during Nero's reign, two of the finest military men in the empire were the Flavians, Vespasian and his son Titus.
Vespasian and Titus were military men. They spent a great deal of their life outside of Rome. For over a decade, they had waged war against the Druids in Brittany and Gaul. Vespasian and Titus were successful in essentially destroying the Druids. They left behind no historical record of their existence.
And it's the Flavians that Nero calls upon when he needs to suppress the Jews' rebellion in Judea.
Nero responded by asking his best general, Vespasian, and his son Titus to go into Judea with a huge army, 70,000 troops, and a similar number of support individuals. So they meant business. The Romans came down to crush the rebellion.
This is all just a history lesson. They're not saying anything out of the ordinary. This is all in Josephus' Wars of the Jews, probably about chapters 4 and 5, so you can read it for yourself.
In the year 66 CE, the Flavians begin their military campaign against the Jews. They start further north in Galilee, where the first of 3 key events takes place. They destroy the Jewish towns of Galilee. They also capture a Jewish rebel who later becomes a critical figure in the formulation of Christianity.
A critical figure in the formulation of Christianity. Well, this is Josephus, but before even telling you his name, they are telling you that he helped formulate Christianity, which is an outright lie. Of all of Josephus' writings, only 2 lines out of thousands even reference the Christians in Jesus Christ. And the funny thing is, scholars like Joseph Atwill, secular scholars, have been trying to discredit those lines in Josephus for hundreds of years. It's called the Testimonium Flavianum. There's 2 different lines in different portions of all of Josephus' writings, only 2 lines, and they do mention Christ and Christians. But now these secular scholars like Joseph Atwill want you to believe that they've turned 180 degrees and that Josephus was instrumental in forming Christianity, when all he did was historical record keeping for the Caesars. And in fact, it's likely because he didn't write his histories until about 90 AD or thereabouts, it's likely he was trying to preserve the history of the Jews and what happened to them. And it was just because he had served the Flavian emperors Titus and Vespasian that they allowed him to publish it. Because as you'll see when we go a little further, Titus and Vespasian didn't want to eradicate the Jews. It was never their intention.
This is where they captured one of the leaders of the rebellion, a Jew named Josephus Bar Matthias. Now, Josephus presented himself to the Flavians as a prophet.
He survived. He survived apparently by telling Vespasian that the prophecies of the Jews pointed out that Vespasian would become emperor. And of course he did, so Vespasian quite liked Josephus. He used him as a translator in his entourage. He used him to appeal to the rebels to surrender.
At this point, Josephus became a turncoat and worked with the Flavians against the rebellion.
Josephus worked with the Flavians against the rebellion. Well, that is true in a sense, but Josephus had been, and he writes about this in Wars of the Jews, Josephus himself had been a leader in the Jewish zealot army. He did it reluctantly. He didn't want to do it, but he got kind of pushed into it by the zealots and forced to become a leader in one of their rebellions, one of their skirmishes. So he was captured, and so he told the Romans that he was a prophet and foretold that Vespasian would soon be emperor. And why do you think that is? It's probably because he wanted to gain enough favor with them so they didn't kill him for being, fighting against them and leading the Jews against them. So he came up with this, probably with the story that he was a prophet, and he said, I prophesy that Vespasian will be the emperor, and that he might have even said, because he writes some of this in Wars of the Jews, he may have said that he thought Vespasian was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. But he did it so that they wouldn't kill him. The Jews actually hated him for serving the Romans, and he was distrusted by most Romans also because he was a Jew. But Titus and Vespasian did keep him with them during the battles in Jerusalem so that he could appeal to the Jews himself, Jew to Jew. And so they would have him from time to time go in and try to talk down the Jews from fighting the battles and give them Titus's terms. After the Jewish war, he lived as a citizen in Rome. He wasn't living with the Flavians when he was in Rome. He was just there because he was then a citizen of Rome. He had earned his citizenship by serving them during the wars. His Wars of the Jews that we're talking the most about was written in 75 AD, 5 years after the destruction of the temple, and his Antiquities of the Jews was written in 93 AD. Again, like I said, it was most likely so he could preserve the history of his people, which he, in his writings, still has much concern and love for, even though he was serving, in some regards, served the Romans for a while, probably to save his own life.
Meanwhile, chaos is increasing back in Rome, where Nero's rule is being threatened.
Long section of history lessons here, so it's going to play for a minute.
In the year 68, the Senate found the courage to depose Nero, and he committed suicide. Now, in that circumstance, Vespasian was a prime candidate to become emperor.
In the middle of this war, Vespasian returned to Rome and seized the throne. The Flavians then became the imperial family.
With Vespasian becoming the new Caesar in Rome, Titus stays behind on the battlefield and sets his sights on Jerusalem, where the other two key events take place. Titus encircles Jerusalem with a wall, and finally he razes the temple, leaving not one stone atop another.
It took a while. They eventually had to bring on starvation by building a wall, a barricade entirely enveloping the city.
What happens, of course, is the temple in 70 is completely destroyed.
For the Jews, it was the ultimate calamity because, of course, this was the house of their god, and it was destroyed by the Romans quite thoroughly.
The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, this was a complete end of the system of ritual and law for the Jews. It had been foretold by Jesus Christ himself in the multiple writings of the early Christians, and he had said this to the disciples and to other Christians. It was talked about in the New Testament books, which had been written before 70 AD, and that it was all going to come soon and happen quickly. It was a fulfillment of a major portion of the prophecy contained in the Bible in both the Old and the New Testaments. They all foretold the destruction of the Jewish priesthood, the destruction of the temple, and the severe judgment that the Jews were going to bring upon themselves by the hand of God. And this was it. And in the book, in Atwill's book, page 14, and they just said it a second ago in the video, they make this point that Titus left no stone setting upon one another. And this was actually a quote they took from the Bible, from the New Testament, where Jesus said in his predictions in Matthew 24 that there would not be one stone left upon another in the temple. And so the problem is, because Joseph Atwill and crew are going to say that Titus and the Flavians wrote this book and said it because they had done it. But Josephus records something a little opposite of that, and that is that Titus didn't want to burn or destroy the temple at all. Josephus records this in multiple places. It wasn't his intention to destroy it, but he couldn't stop the soldiers at one point in the war, and they set fire to it. And because the Jews kept fighting and he couldn't control the situation, they ended up having to destroy it. It was already destroyed, and he said, because it's already destroyed and I'm losing my soldiers, just take it to the ground. He didn't intentionally want to do that. He even gave a speech to the Jews before they destroyed the temple that he wanted to preserve their temple and their buildings, and that any of them who surrendered would probably not be killed. But they wouldn't have it. The Jews kept fighting. So Titus didn't want to destroy the temple, according to Josephus. So all their points about that he fulfilled this thing that was in the New Testament was not true. The New Testament said it beforehand and predicted it, and Titus didn't intentionally fulfill it. He didn't want to destroy the temple. It was the soldiers that destroyed the temple.
Titus,
it's going to be a long history lesson here now.
Of this great
about a minute's worth.
Titus carried the spoils of this captured city back to Rome for his triumph. He took the treasures of the temple, their famous 7-branch candlestick. You can see it on the Arch of Titus in Rome. It celebrates that tremendous victory of Rome again triumphant, and Titus, of course, is the hero of the day.
All of the artifacts from the temple that they seized, they put on public display in what they refer to as the Palace of Peace, except for one item. The Jewish scripture, Josephus records that the Flavians took and placed in their private palace where no one was allowed to see it.
Although Titus Flavius successfully ended the rebellion in Judea, another rebellion soon broke out in Alexandria, Egypt. The Flavians were clear that this was not the end of the Jewish Messianic movement. They also recognized that it was the Jews' Messianic literature that was fueling this movement. So once they captured the Jewish scripture, they had all other copies of it destroyed.
Well, in Joseph Atwill's book, and we've heard it here just a second ago, page 18 in the book, it says they took the Jewish scripture and placed it in their private palace, the Titus and Vespasian. They put the Jewish scripture in their palace. Well, that is what Josephus says. It says that he built a palace, Titus built a palace of peace to house all the spoils of the temple that you saw carried in on the Arch of Titus, as was shown, except the law of the Jews, the Old Testament writings. But in Josephus' Wars 757, it says, he still gave order that they should lay up their law and the purple veils of the holy place in the royal palace itself and keep them there. It does not say, so no one could see them. Joseph Atwill and company are rewriting things and saying things in a way that makes you think they were locking them away so that only they could read them and only they could use them, and only they would then be able to use them and try to subvert and create Christianity, which is ridiculous. And then they say in the video, after this, they had all the other copies of the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, destroyed, and that there was a rebellion in Alexandria. Well, there was a Jewish riot in Alexandria that occurred in 66 AD, 3 years before the destruction of the temple, not after it. But then Jews were fleeing to Egypt, in Alexandria and around that area, throughout the siege on Jerusalem to try to get away. But there's absolutely zero record of any Flavian having the Jewish scriptures destroyed. None. And if you take that in conjunction with the fact that Titus, throughout the Josephus record, was trying to refrain from destroying the Jewish temple and all their accoutrements and everything, he was trying not to destroy it. He even says in a quote in Josephus that he didn't want to take out their vengeance on the inanimate objects of the temple, but on the people, on the Jews who were fighting. It was never his intention to destroy that temple and the stuff in it. But there's just no record of them destroying all the scriptures. There's no writing that says that they tried to do this or wanted to do this. There was a Roman emperor that did try to do this. It was Diocletian, and that was 120 or 130 years later, in 200 AD. So that's obviously not related to this in any way whatsoever, and there's no record of any command or any destroying of Jewish scriptures at all by the Flavians.
And that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls had to have been buried in a cave, because that was the only way they could be safe from the Roman destruction.
The only way they could be safe from Roman destruction. False. There's no record of Romans destroying scriptures. Titus didn't even want to destroy the temple, as I just said. He says it numerous times in Josephus' writings. And he gives a speech to the Jews. He even gives a speech to them about how he was going to spare their temple and would spare them if they surrendered. It's just lie after lie in this video.
There was not a single scrap of literature found from the Messianic movement until the scrolls were discovered. That's why they're such a treasure.
Not a single scrap of Messianic literature found until the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is so false. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947. Are you trying to say, Joseph Atwill, that we didn't have or find any of the Jewish writings from the year 70 AD until 1947 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found? That is absolutely preposterous. We've been finding and preserving Jewish scriptures for centuries since the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and before it. They had the Septuagint at that time. We've had many copies of it in Syriac, Aramaic, Greek. All this, it's all their literature. It was rewritten in the Septuagint. We've had that for centuries, since that time period. There's just so much lying going on. It's ridiculous. If we had no Messianic Jewish scriptures before 1947, Joseph, then we would not have the Bible. But we do. Because the Old Testament is the Jewish scriptures. Atwill is just peddling falsehoods again and again.
Because they're the only real voice of the Messianic movement that we have.
And the real voice of the Jews' Messianic movement, according to our scholars, was violent and militaristic, not the pacifistic version depicted in the Gospels.
War against Rome was a Messianic war. So that's why I say that the scrolls are not only the literature of the Messianic movement in Palestine, they're also the literature of the war against Rome.
So Atwill will again and again try to make you think that the Jewish zealots represented all of Jewish thought in the first century and that they had a messianic and militaristic agenda. But they have to keep pushing that messianic idea because that is what fits into their narrative better than anything else. Not that the Jews were overtaxed and hurting and poor, and that the Romans had taken control of their monetary system, and that the Romans were ruining the way they were trying to do their government and law, and the Jews had had enough. It's not that. To Joseph Atwill, it was all about the Messiah, although there's no evidence. He just lumps all the Jews together. He must make you believe this, because otherwise the rest of his conjectures don't work. And there's just no evidence of this, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he's talked so much about. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves don't give you evidence that all the Jews were militaristic in nature or that they all thought that the Messiah would be a military leader who would crush the Romans. It's possible there was a misinterpretation of the Old Testament prophecies, but the Dead Sea Scrolls don't do anything in addition to what's in the Old Testament prophecies. He just hopes you haven't read the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you know what? They're all online. I've read most of them. I encourage you to read them too, so you don't get tricked by this stuff, by these kinds of videos. That is all you got time for in part 2. So thank you for joining, and we will have a part 3. We are now 18 and a half minutes through this hour and 23-minute video. And like I said, it takes time to debunk and unweave all the lies that are being spewed at you with a fire hose throughout this quote-unquote documentary. So thank you for spending time with me. I hope you're getting a lot of good information out of this. Join me again for part 3.